August 7th, 1941, 0610 hours, Kashima Air Station on the eastern coast of Honshu. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood beside a row of A6M2 Model 21-0 fighters, their wings beaded with dew, their sockeye 12 engines still cold. He had been awake since 0300 hours, reviewing a report from the Naval Aviation Bureau detailing American naval appropriations for the coming fiscal year. The numbers were precise, alarming, and, if accurate, transformative. Within 24 months, the United States planned to expand aircraft output to more than 18,000 units per year. Carrier construction would accelerate. Fuel reserves were climbing. The industrial center of gravity in California and the Northeast was mobilizing on a scale no Japanese planner had imagined possible in 1937. At 0611 hours, Yamamoto listened to the engines warming on the airfield. Their steady vibration contrasted with the seismic shift taking place inside his mind. The fighter before him weighed roughly 2,400 kilograms and required a factory workforce of hundreds across several subcontractors. Yet the Americans were preparing to produce aircraft not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. If these trends continued, any Pacific War would become a contest determined not by daring pilots or brilliant tactics, but by mass, tempo, and supply lines stretching across oceans. He turned to his chief of staff and asked a single-pointed question. If the Americans build at this rate, how long can we fight before we exhaust ourselves? The officer had no answer. Yamamoto did not need one. In that moment, 9 months before the first dive bomber lifted off from USS Yorktown. At Midway, he understood the trajectory of the war. A maritime empire with limited oil reserves, modest steel output, and tightly constrained shipping capacity could not defeat an industrial giant whose factories were expanding faster than Japan could train carrier pilots. The morning sun crept over the airfield as mechanics tightened bolts and pilots conducted pre-flight checks. Yamamoto folded the report once, slid it into his tunic, and walked toward the operations building. Where the air smelled of gasoline and wet earth, he knew he would soon be ordered to devise a strategy to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But no matter how daring the plan, the underlying arithmetic was against him. The war could be won in months or lost in years, but the long-term logic was already visible in the columns of steel tonnage, refinery throughput, and aircraft output that lay on his desk. The crisis of the Pacific War did not begin at Pearl Harbor or even at Midway. It began here, at 0610 hours on a quiet August morning, when a single admiral realized that Japan's industrial ceiling made victory mathematically improbable. The months that followed would only reaffirm what he saw clearly in that moment. Yamamoto's realization emerged from a complex web of strategic, industrial, and political developments spanning several years. Born in 1884, he had trained as a naval officer, survived the Battle of Tsushima, and studied in the United States. Between 1919 and 1921, he attended Harvard University, later serving as naval attaché in Washington. These experiences gave him deep insight into U.S. resources, its vast oil fields in Texas and California, its steel production in Pittsburgh and Chicago, and its industrial corridors staffed by millions of workers. Unlike many officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Yamamoto had walked inside American factories, seen automobile assembly lines, and visited naval yards that dwarfed anything in Yokosuka or Kure. By the late 1930s, Japan had become deeply dependent on imported oil, approximately 80 to 90% of its total consumption. More than 75% of that oil came from the United States. Japanese refineries lacked capacity, synthetic fuel research lagged behind German models, and tanker fleets were limited. Even before the Pacific War began, the nation's industrial base was straining to maintain operations in China. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone consumed roughly 3 million barrels of fuel oil annually during peacetime. In a full-scale war, the requirement would double. Yamamoto tracked these figures closely. In January 1941, he received updated intelligence indicating that American aviation gasoline production had increased by 40% between 1939 and 1940. U.S. naval construction had also accelerated under the II Ocean Navy Act of July 1940, authorizing 18 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 33 cruisers, 115 destroyers, and 43 submarines. Japanese shipyards lacked the steel and labor to match even half that pace. The disparity grew more severe each month. At 0830 hours on February 3, 1941, Yamamoto convened a meeting at the Naval Staff College in Tokyo. The agenda centered on American industrial capabilities and the potential consequences of an oil embargo. Several officers argued that Japan could defeat the U.S. fleet quickly through a decisive battle, using fast carrier groups to neutralize American bases from Hawaii to the Philippines. Others believed the Americans lacked the will to fight a long war. Yamamoto disagreed. He explained that an American industrial system capable of building 3,000 aircraft per year before full mobilization could produce 10 times that once mobilization began. If Japan started a war without securing a rapid strategic collapse of American naval power, the conflict would become unwinnable. Throughout early 1941, Yamamoto became increasingly isolated within the Naval High Command. He supported negotiations with Washington, warning that war would expose Japan's industrial vulnerabilities. His warnings did not stem from pessimism, but from cold calculations. Japan produced approximately 6 million tons of steel annually. The United States produced about 47 million. Japanese aircraft factories could produce around 5,000 planes per year with maximum effort. American industry, once fully mobilized, could exceed 50,000. Shipping tonnage was also lopsided. Japan controlled about 6 million tons of merchant shipping, much of it older and slower. The U.S. Maritime Commission planned to produce Liberty ships at a rate of one per day by 1943. These numbers shaped Yamamoto's strategic doctrines. He believed Japan could achieve tactical success through training, superior naval aviation, and innovative carrier strategies. But he also knew these advantages would erode as the U.S. mobilized. This belief drove his insistence on the concentration of naval air power into carrier strike groups, an idea not widely accepted until the late 1930s. He argued that battleships, symbols of naval prestige, would prove irrelevant against massed aircraft. In March 1941, Yamamoto inspected a formation of carrier aircraft aboard Akagi during training exercises in the Philippine Sea. He observed the launch of 36 B-5N torpedo bombers, followed by 27 D-3A dive bombers and 18 A-6M fighters. The coordination impressed him, but it also reminded him of Japan's limited reserves. Each aircraft represented months of production, skilled labor, and scarce materials like aluminum, rubber, and high-octane fuel. Each pilot represented at least 2 years of training. Japan could not easily replace them. At 10:15 hours on May 12, 1941, Yamamoto received a briefing from the Naval Aviation Bureau, forecasting fuel consumption rates for potential operations. A campaign against American and British positions in Southeast Asia would require approximately 1.2 million barrels of aviation gasoline and 5 million barrels of fuel oil in the first 6 months alone. Japan's strategic reserves amounted to roughly 50 million barrels in total, far less than what would be required for a sustained war. During the summer of 1941, U.S.-Japanese relations deteriorated further. On July 26th, the United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a full oil embargo. Tanker deliveries stopped. The Japanese Navy estimated that, without imports, fuel reserves would last for 18 to 24 months under wartime conditions. This timeline became central to Yamamoto's thinking. If war began now, Japan needed quick victories that reduced operational demands, gained access to resource fields in the Dutch East Indies, and forced the United States to negotiate. But even this best-case scenario depended on preventing American carriers from interfering with Japanese movement in the Western Pacific. Thus, in late July and early August 1941, Yamamoto considered a strategy so radical that many senior officers rejected it immediately: a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could deploy. It was during this period that the August 7th morning described earlier unfolded. Yamamoto had just reviewed the newest American production forecasts. The figures came from open-source intelligence, embassy contacts, and commercial shipping manifests. They painted a picture of a nation accelerating its manufacturing capacity to unprecedented levels. Detroit's automobile factories were preparing for full wartime conversion. Boeing and Douglas were expanding assembly lines. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts were receiving new cranes, welding stations, and contracts. The quantitative difference between Japan and the United States was widening into a gulf. On August 10th, at 14:30 hours, Yamamoto briefed his senior aides in Nagoya. He explained the underlying logic of his thinking. Japan could win only if it destroyed American naval power faster than American industry could replace it. This required preemptive strikes, rapid expansion into resource-rich territories, and a defensive perimeter so large that the United States would face insurmountable logistical hurdles trying to break it. He estimated Japan had a window of no more than 6 to 12 months from the start of a war to achieve these objectives. His staff recorded his words carefully. He did not express confidence. He expressed necessity. In September 1941, Yamamoto's concept for an attack on Pearl Harbor took clearer shape. He believed 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, could deliver a decisive blow with more than 350 aircraft. But even in advocating this plan, Yamamoto acknowledged its limitations. Aircraft losses would strain Japan's training pipeline. Replacement engines and spare parts would be limited. The Americans could rebuild Pearl Harbor's facilities within months, and despite heavy losses, U.S. carriers could survive if not in port at the time of attack. At 2000 hours on October 17th, Yamamoto met privately with Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, his chief of staff. Ugaki noted in his diary that Yamamoto expressed deep concern that Japan was underestimating American resolve and industrial depth. Yamamoto stated plainly, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months or a year. But after that, I have no expectation of victory." This prediction would prove almost prophetic. By December 1941, when the attack on Pearl Harbor commenced at 07:55 hours, Yamamoto's warning had already been fulfilled in part. The Americans lost battleships, but not carriers. Their industrial mobilization leapt forward. Aircraft production surged from 19,000 units in 1941 to over 48,000 hours in 1942. Shipyards produced 5 escort carriers in 1941. They produced more than 40 in 1942. Japanese naval aviation, despite early victories, could not match these rates. As Japan advanced across the Pacific, capturing Guam, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, its industrial vulnerabilities deepened. Pilot training schools expanded but could not maintain quality. Aircraft factories increased output modestly but struggled with material shortages. Fuel stocks fell as operations intensified. By early spring 1942, as the Japanese High Command planned a major operation to lure American carriers into battle near Midway, Yamamoto privately feared that time had run out. The Americans had not collapsed after Pearl Harbor. They had accelerated. The window he calculated, the 6 to 12 months of strategic opportunity, was closing. In the weeks before Midway, intelligence failures and scattered forces compounded Japan's disadvantages. Yamamoto's carriers remained formidable, but their aircraft crews had suffered attrition since the start of the war. Spare parts were limited. Replacement pilots had fewer flying hours. Meanwhile, American code breakers at Station Haipo had penetrated Japanese communications, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz asymmetric information about the impending operation. By June 3, 1942, as Japanese forces approached Midway Atoll, Yamamoto found himself commanding a fleet that appeared strong on paper but was already losing the industrial and intelligence war beneath the surface. He had predicted this outcome 9 months earlier. Now he was living inside the consequences of the arithmetic he had recognized on that quiet August morning. The moment of realization, the moment he understood the Pacific was likely lost in the long term, lay not at Midway but here, months earlier, when production tables, steel yields, refinery totals, and aircraft output curves revealed a strategic truth no tactic could overcome. The battle that would confirm his fears was only weeks away. Chapter 2. The first carriers of the Kido Butai approached their Midway launch positions on June 3, 1942 at 04:30 hours, moving in a northwesterly arc, roughly 240 nautical miles from the atoll. Dawn lit the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Flight crews prepared B-5N2 torpedo bombers, D-3A1 dive bombers, and A-6M2 fighters for the first wave. But even as the engines warmed, the tone aboard the task force was subtly different from the heady months after Pearl Harbor. Losses at Coral Sea had thinned experienced torpedo bomber crews. Replacement pilots had logged fewer hours, some barely 300 compared to the 600, 800 typical of 1941 veterans. Maintenance teams were stretched, spare engines were limited, every sortie consumed irreplaceable fuel. In the flagship's operations room, Yamamoto reviewed the latest reports. Communications from the advance guard indicated no detection, but he sensed a pattern beneath the silence. The Americans had failed to appear where expected at Coral Sea, then struck with precise timing. He knew their radio operators could be listening, decrypting, assembling mosaic pieces of the coming operation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had underestimated American code breaking since 1941. It was now a strategic factor, not visible, not announced, but present in every unexplained delay or absence of enemy forces. At 04:35 hours, carrier decks came alive. The first wave under Lieutenant Commander Tominaga launched 36 dive bombers, 36 level bombers, and 36 fighters. Their task was to neutralize Midway's airfields. As the aircraft climbed, the carriers turned into the wind to recover combat air patrol fighters. Everything looked routine, but the Americans were already moving. At 05:30 hours, a PBY Catalina from Patrol Squadron 23 transmitted a contact report. It cited elements of Yamamoto's inbound forces. By 0600 hours, Admiral Chester Nimitz had confirmation. American carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, positioned northeast of Midway, prepared their own strike groups. Here, the disparity in logistics and deck cycles became clear. The Americans could mass 41 TBD torpedo bombers, 28 SBD dive bombers, and 29 F-4F fighters across 3 decks with relative ease. Despite their earlier losses in crew quality, their training pipeline and industrial base had strengthened, not weakened, since December 1941. At 700 hours, as Japanese bombers struck Midway's runways, Colonel Harold Richards scrambled Marine fighter squadrons. The Buffalo and Wildcat fighters at Midway were outmatched, losing heavily. But each engagement burned minutes. Minutes that delayed Japanese readiness to launch a second wave, minutes the U.S. carriers used to close distance. Nagumo's decision point emerged at 7:05 hours. Midway remained operational. A second strike seemed necessary, yet reconnaissance failed to confirm American carriers. Nagumo followed standing doctrine, rearmed the reserve strike force for a second attack on Midway. On Akagi and Kaga, armor-piercing bombs were offloaded and replaced with high-explosive ordnance. Torpedoes were moved, aircraft were repositioned. Hangar decks became crowded with fueled, partially armed aircraft. The process required roughly 45 minutes, but depended on ideal conditions and uninterrupted deck flow. That assumption was dangerous. At 07:45 hours, a spotter plane finally reported American ships to the northeast. The timing could not have been worse. Nagumo ordered the rearmament reversed. Crews scrambled to restore torpedo loads. Live ordnance was rolled back into racks. Bomb carts clattered. The hangars became a maze of engines, hoses, and open fuel lines. Deck safety margins evaporated. At 8:20 hours, U.S. Marine pilots launched another attack on the Japanese fleet, forcing carrier captains to maneuver violently. None of the American attacks succeeded, but they served a larger purpose. Every minute of evasion delayed Japanese launch readiness. Every alteration, of course, disrupted wind alignment for flight operations. This cascading disruption turned an efficient strike force into a vulnerable one. At 09:18 hours, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet began its attack run. 15 TBD Devastators flew low at roughly 100 knots. None returned. Their torpedoes ran slow and shallow. Japanese Zeros cut them down mercilessly. Yet the tactical failure masked a strategic success. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level, chasing slow torpedo bombers. Altitude discipline broke. Fighters were out of position. At 10:22 hours, the sky changed. From 14,000 feet, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise appeared almost simultaneously with 17 from Yorktown. They had navigated through cloud cover, guided by radar vectors and communications networks Japan lacked. Their arrival aligned with a 3 and 4 minute window in which Japanese carriers were turning into the wind, decks cluttered, fighters misplaced, and hangar crews surrounded by fueled and armed aircraft. At 10:24 hours, the first bomb struck Kaga. A 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck, detonating among fueled aircraft. A second smashed through the forward hangar. Flames erupted instantly, fed by gasoline lines and stacked ordnance. 20 seconds later, Akagi was hit. A single bomb pierced her center deck and exploded near the steering compartment. Fires spread across the hangar where torpedo bombers stood fueled. Damage control teams fought desperately but lacked the foam-generating equipment American ships carried. At 10:25 hours, Soryu received 3 direct hits. Her flight deck collapsed inward, flames engulfing the hangar. 3 carriers were burning within moments. In the carrier's flag plot, aboard Yamato, positioned far to the rear, Yamamoto received fragmented communications. At 10:40 hours, he was informed that Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were likely lost. He paused for several seconds, silently absorbing the magnitude of the disaster. This was not a tactical failure alone. It was the industrial logic he had foreseen 9 months earlier unfolding in real time. The Americans had lost Lexington at Coral Sea and suffered heavy damage to Yorktown. Yet Yorktown had been repaired at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours. Japan could not perform comparable miracles. Japanese dry dock capacity was limited. Replacement carriers required years, not months. Aircrew losses were irreplaceable. At 10:55 hours, Yamamoto ordered Hiryu to continue the attack independently. Hiryu launched 2 waves that struck Yorktown, inflicting severe damage. But by mid-afternoon, the last Japanese carrier faced overwhelming American air power. At 17:03 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise crippled Hiryu. Flames consumed her decks. By nightfall on June 4th, the Kido Butai, the elite corps of Japanese naval aviation, had ceased to exist. 4 carriers, more than 250 aircraft, and irreplaceable air crews were gone. Even if Japan continued fighting, its strategic trajectory had changed permanently. Yamamoto considered continuing the engagement with battleships during the night. But by 02:30 hours on June 5th, he recognized the futility. The Americans possessed intact carrier groups, superior radar-guided night fighting capabilities, and faster logistics. The Japanese fleet withdrew. The next morning, as reports arrived listing the names of lost pilots, Yamamoto returned to the arithmetic that had troubled him in August 1941. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. By mid-1942, more than a quarter had been lost. Training replacements required a minimum of 18 months, longer for torpedo bomber crews. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 2,000 new aviators per month by late 1942. Aircraft losses told the same story. Japanese factories produced roughly 8,800 aircraft in 1941 and 8,900 in 1942. American factories produced 19,000 in 1941 and 47,800 in 1942. Carrier construction was even more decisive. While Japan struggled to complete Taiho and convert merchant hulls into light carriers, the United States commissioned 10 Essex-class carriers in 1943 alone. Shipping capacity amplified the disparity. Japan's 6 million tons of merchant shipping were being reduced monthly by American submarines. The U.S. merchant fleet, by contrast, expanded rapidly. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines at the rate of 3 every 2 days. Midway did not merely sink carriers, it exposed the structural impossibility of Japan winning a long war. No tactical brilliance, no bold gamble could overcome the industrial ratios. Yamamoto had predicted this truth when he said he could run wild for 6 months, but no longer. His prediction proved exact. From December 1941 to June 1942, just about 6 months, Japan seized territory across the Pacific. But by the end of that 6th month, the blow at Midway shifted the balance irreversibly. In the months after Midway, Japan attempted to regroup. Training programs were expanded, production quotas increased, but shortages in aluminum, aviation gasoline, and experienced instructors crippled effectiveness. Carrier decks that once launched elite aircrews now carried novices with half the flying hours of their predecessors. Meanwhile, American radar networks, code-breaking teams, and logistical systems grew into a cohesive machine. Yamamoto understood the implications. His cautious optimism before the war had already been tempered by industrial math. Midway confirmed it decisively. Japan's early victories had been achieved by a small cadre of highly trained personnel and a concentrated force of frontline carriers. But these assets were finite, and American replacements were infinite by comparison. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto was killed when American P-38 Lightnings intercepted his transport in Operation Vengeance, a mission made possible by signals intelligence and the very systems-oriented warfare he feared Japan could not match. His death symbolized the shift. The Pacific War had become defined by intelligence networks, industrial depth, and long-range air power. Japan could strike hard but could not replenish what it lost. The immediate consequence of Midway was the halt of Japanese expansion. The long-term consequence was the certainty of defeat. From Guadalcanal to the Marianas and Leyte Gulf, every campaign reflected the imbalance Yamamoto recognized before Pearl Harbor. His enduring lesson was not about courage or daring, but about arithmetic. Wars of attrition are decided long before the first shot is fired, decided in factories, shipyards, fuel depots, and training centers. Japan entered the war with extraordinary pilots and elite carriers. It ended the war with neither. The United States entered the war with massive industrial potential. It ended the war having transformed that potential into overwhelming force. The Pacific was lost, not at Midway, but when Japan chose to fight a nation whose productive capacity exceeded its own by almost every measure. Midway merely confirmed the trajectory Yamamoto read in those production tables 9 months earlier. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.